10 years ago, Darius believed he had simply helped a stranded stranger and driven away. He never imagined that one selfless choice would quietly shape the future of a billion-dollar company. Now, standing accused of being the man who threatened children's safety, he watches the woman he once saved walk past him without recognition, until she returns with a whisper that changes everything. This is a story about forgotten kindness, hidden truth, and how one ordinary man discovered that the greatest rewards sometimes arrive long after hope has faded. The hearing room inside the Lake Briar Board of Education building smelled faintly of old coffee, printer toner, and rain-soaked coats. Every seat was taken. Parents whispered behind folded programs. Reporters adjusted cameras along the back wall. School officials shuffled thick binders across polished oak tables, while attorneys spoke in low voices that carried just enough confidence to make everyone else uneasy. Darius Cole paused outside the doorway for one last breath before stepping inside. His Navy mechanic's uniform still carried dark streaks of grease across the sleeves. He had considered changing into a clean shirt before coming, but there hadn't been time. Besides, pretending to be someone else had never helped him before. His employee badge hung uselessly from his pocket instead of his collar. Deactivated, suspended. One word had erased 15 years of honest work. He tightened his fingers around the edge of a worn notebook filled with handwritten inspection notes. The pages inside represented weeks of testing that no computer had bothered to perform. A security officer pointed him toward the witness table. "This way, Mr. Cole." Every pair of eyes seemed to follow him as he crossed the room. Some recognized him from the local news. Others recognized him as the mechanic accused of disrupting the largest school transportation project Lake Briar had ever approved. A headline flashed briefly on one television screen near the reporter's table. "Local mechanic claims new school buses are unsafe." Another headline underneath questioned whether the accusations had already cost taxpayers millions. Darius ignored both. He pulled out his chair and quietly sat down. Across the room sat executives from Heartline Mobility, dressed in tailored suits that reflected the bright ceiling lights. Their folders were perfectly organized. Their legal team looked calm, almost relaxed. Darius looked down at his own hands. The faint cuts around his knuckles hadn't completely healed from pulling apart emergency door mechanisms only days earlier. Hands built for fixing things, not for courtrooms. A clerk tested the microphone. "We'll begin in just a few moments." The room settled into an uneasy silence. Darius glanced toward the entrance again. She wasn't here yet. For 3 weeks, one question had followed him everywhere. Would Evelyn Hart remember? 10 years earlier, she had been a young engineer standing beside a disabled prototype in the middle of a cold rainstorm. Today, she was the CEO of one of the fastest-growing transportation companies in America. Maybe success erased old memories. Maybe she had met thousands of people since then. Maybe one exhausted mechanic on a forgotten roadside had never mattered very much. The heavy doors opened. Conversation stopped almost instantly. Evelyn Hart entered surrounded by 2 attorneys and several senior executives. She wore a charcoal gray suit without a single wrinkle. No dramatic entrance, no cameras invited by her company. She walked with the measured pace of someone carrying far more responsibility than pride. For one brief moment, her eyes met Darius's. Recognition flashed across his face before he could stop it. He almost stood. She didn't. She simply looked at him for a heartbeat, then continued walking as though she had never seen him before. No smile, no hesitation, no sign that they had ever shared a conversation. Darius slowly lowered his gaze. A strange heaviness settled across his chest. So that's it, he thought. She really doesn't remember. The memory he had quietly carried for a decade suddenly felt much smaller than he had imagined. He looked toward the floor. Perhaps Maya had been right to ask why he still kept believing people remembered kindness. Perhaps she had been wrong. Perhaps he had been. The attorneys began arranging documents at the opposite table. Board members took their seats. The hearing was seconds from starting. Then, footsteps stopped beside him. Darius looked up. Evelyn had quietly crossed the aisle alone. No cameras noticed. No reporters looked away from their notes. She leaned down just enough that only he could hear her voice, soft, steady, almost trembling beneath its calm. I waited 10 years. Darius stared at her. His lips parted, but no words came. Waited. For what? For him? Before he could ask another question, Evelyn straightened her posture and returned to the Heartline table without another glance. The room remained completely unaware that anything unusual had happened. The chair of the board struck the gavel. We'll now begin today's public hearing regarding the Heartline Mobility School Transportation Contract. Before Darius could collect his thoughts, Heartline's lead attorney rose smoothly to his feet. He buttoned his jacket, faced the board, then pointed directly toward Darius. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said evenly, "before this hearing goes any further, the evidence will show that Mr. Cole is not the man who uncovered a dangerous defect." He paused just long enough for every eye in the room to return to Darius. "The evidence will show that he is the one who damaged the vehicle." A quiet wave of whispers rolled through the audience. Several reporters immediately lowered their heads to scribble notes. Camera lenses shifted toward Darius. A mother sitting in the front row gently pulled her son's hand into her own, as if the accusation alone had changed the room. Darius didn't move. He had spent enough years around heavy machinery to know that panic usually made broken things worse. The attorney continued calmly. "Mr. Cole knowingly disassembled a certified emergency exit system without authorization. His actions compromised evidence, interrupted an active transportation contract, and created unnecessary public concern." A photograph appeared on the large screen. It showed Darius kneeling beside the rear door of one of the electric buses, his hands inside the emergency panel. Another photo followed, then another. Each one captured only a fraction of what had happened. None showed the terrified children. None showed Lucas trapped inside his wheelchair. None showed Maya pounding on the window while smoke from the emergency drill drifted across the aisle. The attorney folded his hands. "Our client believes safety is paramount, but safety also requires procedure. Mr. Cole chose to ignore established engineering protocols." Several board members exchanged uncertain looks. One of them adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Cole," he asked, "did you remove components from that vehicle?" Darius leaned towards the microphone. "Yes, sir." Another ripple moved through the room, but only after the emergency door failed to open. The attorney interrupted immediately. "So you admit altering company equipment?" "I admit saving children who couldn't get out." Silence settled over the hearing room. Darius's voice never rose. He wasn't trying to win an argument. He was simply answering the question that had been asked. The attorney gave a polite smile. "And you're not a licensed design engineer, correct?" "No." "You don't hold patents involving emergency transportation systems?" "No." "So your conclusion that Heartline's vehicles contain a design defect is simply your personal opinion?" Darius looked toward the board instead of the attorney. "My opinion doesn't matter." The sentence surprised everyone. "What matters," he continued quietly, "is whether that door opens when children need it." Across the room, Evelyn Hart remained perfectly still. Her hands rested on a closed leather folder. She hadn't looked away from Darius once. The chairman turned another page inside the hearing packet. "There are inspection reports indicating the buses passed every required federal certification." "I've read those reports," Darius answered. "And yet you still challenged them?" "Yes." "Why?" Darius hesitated. Not because he doubted himself, because he knew exactly how unbelievable his answer would sound. I heard something. The room frowned collectively. A sound? A very small one. He held his fingers less than an inch apart. A faint metallic chirp inside the rear latch. It only happened when the power transferred between the main battery and the backup system. The attorney almost laughed. So this entire hearing began because you heard a noise? It began because I listened. The words landed harder than he intended. Even the reporters stopped typing for a moment. From across the room, Evelyn slowly lowered her eyes. Something in Darius's answer seemed to reach farther than the hearing itself. It sounded less like testimony and more like a memory. The chairman prepared to call the next witness. Before he could speak, one of the board members quietly asked a final question. Mr. Cole, if you knew making this accusation could cost you your career. He paused. Why didn't you simply sign the inspection paperwork and walk away? Darius looked at the empty space beside the audience where parents had left folded umbrellas dripping onto the polished floor. Then he answered, with almost painful honesty, because my daughter rides those buses. The room fell completely silent. Even Hartline's attorney needed a moment before responding. And for the first time since entering the hearing, Evelyn's fingers tightened around the edge of the old leather folder resting in front of her. The chairman cleared his throat. We'll recess for 15 minutes before hearing additional testimony. The gavel struck. Conversations erupted all at once as reporters hurried into the hallway, board members gathered their notes, and parents quietly debated what they had just witnessed. Darius remained seated for another moment, staring at the empty microphone in front of him. His daughter's face lingered in his mind far more vividly than the crowded hearing room. 3 weeks earlier. The alarm on Darius Cole's old phone buzzed at 4:45 every morning, long before the sun reached the rooftops of Lake Briar's south side. He slipped quietly out of bed so he wouldn't wake Maya, whose breathing had finally settled after another night of asthma. Their apartment was small but spotless. The kitchen table doubled as Maya's homework desk. A tiny calendar hung beside the refrigerator, covered with school events, maintenance shifts, and doctor appointments written in careful blue ink. Several unpaid utility bills rested beneath a coffee mug, hidden just enough that Maya wouldn't notice them. Darius poured cereal into 2 bowls before packing Maya's lunch. He smiled when he added an extra apple. She always traded it for cookies with her best friend. A few minutes later, soft footsteps crossed the hallway. Morning, Dad. Morning, sweetheart. Maya rubbed her sleepy eyes before reaching for her inhaler on the counter. You okay? She nodded with the practiced smile of a child who didn't want her father to worry. I'm good. Darius knew better. He also knew she hated being treated like she was fragile. Outside, an aging pickup truck waited beside the apartment building. Its paint had faded years ago, but the engine still started every morning because Darius refused to let it quit. The ride to Lincoln Middle School was filled with familiar routines. Country music played softly through one speaker that still worked. Maya talked about a science project. Darius listened carefully, even while mentally organizing the repair schedule waiting for him at the transit garage. As she climbed out, Maya suddenly turned back. Don't forget tonight. I won't. You promised. I know. She grinned before disappearing through the front doors. Only after she was gone did Darius notice the small red reflector hanging from his toolbox keyring. A crack ran straight across its center. Someone had carefully wrapped it with an old blue shoelace years ago. He reached over and rubbed his thumb across its rough surface without thinking. That tiny piece of plastic had survived 10 winters, 3 apartments, and every toolbox he'd ever owned. No one at work knew why he kept it. Most assumed it came from an old bus. They were wrong. By 6 o'clock, the maintenance garage echoed with air compressors, impact wrenches, and the smell of warm diesel mixed with fresh coffee. Grant Hollis walked through the service bays holding a clipboard. "Morning, Darius." "Morning. We've got 60 new Heartline buses arriving for final inspection." "I saw the schedule." Grant smiled. "Biggest contract this town has ever signed." Darius nodded. "They're counting on us to get it right." Grant clapped him on the shoulder. "Exactly." Neither man realized that before the month was over, those same 60 buses would pull both of them toward the hearing room where every decision they made would be questioned. As Darius unlocked his toolbox, the cracked reflector caught the first rays of sunlight pouring through the garage doors. One of the younger mechanics pointed toward it with a grin. "You ever gonna throw that thing away?" Darius looked at it for a long second. Then he quietly closed the toolbox. "No." His voice carried a warmth even he couldn't explain. "It reminds me that some promises take longer than expected." The younger mechanic shrugged with a smile and rolled his tool cart toward another service bay. "Whatever works for you, old man." Darius laughed quietly. At 38, he wasn't old, but compared to the newer hires fresh out of technical school, he certainly felt it some mornings. He unlocked the toolbox and pulled out his inspection checklist as the first Heartline electric bus eased into Bay 3. Its silver paint reflected the morning sun. Every panel looked flawless. Fresh tires still carried factory markings. The interior smelled of clean vinyl instead of diesel fuel. One of the delivery engineers grinned proudly. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" Darius nodded. "She is." He always admired good engineering. Beautiful machines deserved careful people. The engineer handed him a thick binder. "Everything passed factory certification." "I'm sure it did." Darius still opened the binder from the first page. Grant walked by carrying another clipboard. "Don't spend all day on the first one. We're already behind schedule." Darius smiled without looking up. "I'll be thorough." Grant chuckled. "I never doubted that." For the next hour, the garage settled into its usual rhythm. Air compressors hissed, metal tools clicked against polished bolts. Forklifts beeped somewhere beyond the open doors. Darius moved methodically around the bus. Brakes, suspension, battery housing, emergency lighting, everything matched the specifications, almost. As he cycled power between the primary battery and the backup system one final time, he froze. A tiny sound, barely louder than the click of a pen. Chirp. He waited. Nothing. He reset the sequence. Again. Chirp. One of the younger mechanics walked past carrying a tire. "You hear that?" The mechanic stopped. "Hear what?" Darius repeated the test. Silence. Then, chirp. "So? It is probably nothing." Maybe, but something deep inside him refused to move on. Machines spoke their own language. Most people listened with computers. Darius listened with experience. He crouched beside the rear emergency exit and rested his fingertips lightly against the latch housing. Again. Battery transfer. Chirp. This time he felt the slightest vibration beneath the metal cover. Not enough for software to recognize. Enough for his hands to notice. Grant returned. "You still on bus 1? I want another hour." Grant frowned. "For what?" "I think something's catching inside the rear latch." Grant glanced toward the waiting line of brand new buses. "The diagnostics are clean." "I know. So what's the problem?" "I don't know yet." Grant sighed. "Darius, we've got 59 more buses behind this one." "I understand. Then sign it." Darius looked back at the door. His pencil hovered above the inspection form. Instead of checking the final approval box, he wrote 3 words: "Further testing required." Grant noticed immediately. "You serious?" "I need to recreate a power failure." The factory already did that. I want to do it again. Grant folded his arms. You've always trusted your instincts. I have. But instincts don't delay million-dollar contracts. Darius quietly closed the clipboard. They shouldn't. He rested one hand on the rear emergency door. But neither should assumptions. Grant studied him for a long moment before shaking his head. You've got until tomorrow morning. No longer. As Grant walked away, Darius remained beside the bus. His fingers traced the edge of the latch once more. The faint chirp echoed inside the metal housing. Tiny, almost invisible, easy for anyone else to dismiss. Then his eyes drifted toward a small identification plate fastened beneath the access panel. Stamped into the brushed aluminum were 2 letters, followed by a number. EH7. Darius stared at the marking. His breathing slowed. He had seen those exact characters once before. Not in this garage, not in Lake Briar, but on a rain-soaked prototype sitting beside a lonely highway 10 years earlier. For the first time since that forgotten night, the past no longer felt finished. Darius ran his thumb across the stamped letters. EH7. The code stirred a memory that had lived quietly in the back of his mind for a decade. Like an old photograph tucked inside a drawer no one opened anymore. Rain. Headlights reflecting off wet pavement. A young woman standing beside a silent prototype. He blinked, forcing himself back to the present. Everything okay? The delivery engineer's voice pulled him out of the moment. Darius nodded slowly. I've seen this code before. The engineer looked at the plate. EH7, that's just an internal engineering designation. You know what it stands for? The man shrugged. Not really. Those codes come from headquarters. Darius didn't answer. He reached for his flashlight and removed the inspection cover once more, carefully examining every linkage around the emergency latch. The mechanism appeared flawless. No cracked welds, no loose fasteners, no damaged springs. Yet the tiny chirp echoed again as the system switched power sources, almost too soft to exist. He repeated the test 6 more times. The sound returned every single time. Grant reappeared carrying a cup of coffee. You still chasing ghosts? I'm chasing something. Grant leaned against the bus. You've been doing this a long time. So have you. Then trust the process. I trust what I can verify. Grant sighed. The school district expects these buses next week. Parents are waiting. Drivers are already being trained. I know. And Heartline has inspectors who spent years designing these systems. Darius closed the access panel. They designed it. He gently tapped the rear door. But this bus is the one carrying kids. Grant studied him for a moment. You really think one little noise means all these buses are unsafe? I think one little noise deserves an explanation. Grant looked toward the rows of identical electric buses lined up outside the garage. Morning sunlight reflected across 60 polished windshields. Millions of dollars. Months of planning. Hundreds of families depending on the project. Against all of that, stood one mechanic listening to a sound nobody else could hear. Grant lowered his voice. Don't make yourself the story, Darius. I'm trying to keep the children from becoming one. For a brief second, neither man spoke. The only sounds came from impact wrenches echoing through the maintenance bays and the distant hiss of compressed air. Finally, Grant straightened. You've got permission to run one additional simulation. Darius looked up. 1. If nothing happens, you sign the paperwork. And if something does happen? Grant hesitated. We'll deal with it. It wasn't the answer Darius wanted, but it was enough. That afternoon, he wheeled a portable battery simulator beside Bus 1 and began recreating conditions far beyond the standard inspection checklist. Voltage dropped, backup power engaged, Interior lights flickered once before stabilizing. Again, chirp. This time he watched the rear latch through a tiny inspection mirror. For less than a second, the locking pin hesitated before settling into place. Not enough for an electronic sensor to register. Enough to catch an experienced mechanic's eye. Darius felt a chill crawl across the back of his neck. He reset the system. Again. The hesitation repeated itself. Tiny. Consistent. Dangerous. He reached for his notebook and carefully wrote the time, battery level, ambient temperature, and every observation by hand. No guesses. Only facts. As he finished the final line, his phone vibrated inside his pocket. The screen lit up with Maya's smiling school picture. But it wasn't Maya calling. It was Lincoln Middle School. And the message waiting on the voicemail would change the urgency of everything he had just discovered. Darius stepped away from the bus before returning the call. "Mr. Cole?" A cheerful voice answered after one ring. "This is Nancy from Lincoln Middle. Is Maya okay?" "She's fine," Nancy said quickly. "I didn't want to worry you. I'm calling because the district finalized next Friday's transportation safety demonstration." Darius relaxed slightly. "Okay. We'll be using one of the new Heartline electric buses. Several students will participate, including Maya." He looked back at Bus 1. The rear emergency door stood only a few feet away. "We're inviting parents, school board members, and local media," Nancy continued. "The children will practice emergency evacuation procedures before the buses enter regular service." His grip tightened around the phone. "Maya already volunteered?" Nancy laughed softly. "You know your daughter. She signed up before we even finished explaining the event." Darius closed his eyes for a moment. "Thank you for letting me know. Will you be able to attend?" "I'll do everything I can." After the call ended, he remained perfectly still. The maintenance bay suddenly felt quieter than before. It was no longer an abstract engineering question. His own daughter would be sitting inside one of these buses. Grant noticed the expression on Darius's face as he walked back across the garage. What happened? Maya's school. Grant waited. "They're using these buses for a public demonstration next week." Grant nodded. "That's good publicity." "She's one of the students." The smile disappeared from Grant's face. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Grant sighed. "They'll be perfectly safe." "I hope you're right." Grant looked toward the inspection sheet resting on the workbench. "You still think there's a problem?" "I think I don't know enough yet." "And until you do, I can't sign." Grant rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Phew, Darius, headquarters is already asking why Bus 1 hasn't been cleared." "Then tell them the inspection isn't finished." "They won't like that answer." "I don't need them to like it. I need them to hear it." Late that afternoon, the garage emptied one truck at a time until only a handful of mechanics remained. The constant roar of impact wrenches faded into scattered echoes. Sunlight stretched across the polished concrete floor. Darius wheeled a portable power cart behind the bus one more time. He wanted to eliminate every possibility. Loose wiring, sensor lag, voltage fluctuation, human error. Methodically, he repeated every step. Battery disconnected. Backup system engaged. Interior lights dimmed. The rear latch gave its familiar metallic chirp. Then something new happened. The locking pin hesitated just long enough for the inspection mirror to catch it. Less than half a second. Almost impossible to notice. Almost. Darius grabbed a marker and circled the exact sequence inside his notebook. He wasn't looking at a broken part. He was looking at a chain of tiny events that, under the wrong circumstances, could happen at exactly the wrong time. A younger mechanic wandered over. "You still here?" "Yeah. You gonna head home?" "In a minute." The mechanic glanced toward the notebook. You know, most people would have signed that paperwork hours ago. Darius smiled faintly. Most people aren't responsible for the kids writing it. The young man nodded before leaving. As the garage grew silent, Darius stood alone beside the bus. His eyes drifted once more to the small aluminum plate. EH7. The code pulled another memory to the surface. Not the rain, not the roadside. A woman's voice. "Fi, if this design ever saves a child," she had said with exhausted gratitude, "it'll be because someone refused to walk away." Darius frowned. Had Evelyn really said that? Or had 10 years blurred memory with hope? He slipped the notebook into his work bag. Tomorrow he would ask for authorization to recreate a complete emergency shutdown under full passenger load conditions. If he was wrong, the tests would prove it. If he was right, next Friday's demonstration could not go forward, and somewhere hundreds of miles away, inside Heartline Mobility's headquarters in Chicago, an engineering archive was about to reveal that the letters stamped into Bus 1 meant far more than a manufacturing code. The following morning, Darius arrived before anyone else. The maintenance garage was still dark, except for a single row of fluorescent lights humming above Bay 3. Outside, a thin layer of fog drifted across the parking lot as delivery trucks rolled past the transit yard. He unlocked the service bay and placed yesterday's notebook beside the diagnostic computer. Every observation, every voltage reading, every timestamp. He intended to prove his concern with facts, not fear. By 7 o'clock, the rest of the crew had arrived. Grant walked directly toward him, carrying a folder stamped with the Heartline Mobility logo. "I've already heard from corporate." Darius looked up. "They want the inspection report. They're getting impatient. I still need one more simulation." Grant exhaled slowly. "You've already run more tests than the factory." "I haven't run the one that matters." Grant opened the folder and laid a printed email across the workbench. "Delivery deadline non-negotiable." Below it sat another line. "Final approval required today." Grant rested both hands on the table. "Darius, if we miss this deadline, our maintenance contract gets penalized." "I know. People lose overtime." "I know. Some may lose positions." Darius remained silent. Grant lowered his voice. "I'm asking you as someone who's worked beside you for 15 years. He slid the inspection form across the bench. "Sign it." The blank approval line seemed strangely heavy. One signature, one stroke of a pen. Everything would disappear. The buses would leave. The contract would continue. His own suspension would never happen. But every time he looked at the paper, he heard that tiny metallic chirp. "I can't." Grant stared at him. "You really think you're protecting people?" "I think I'm trying." Grant picked up the unsigned form. "You know what headquarters will say? They'll say I'm slowing everything down. They'll say you're making claims you can't prove." Darius nodded. "Then I'll prove them." Grant hesitated before speaking again. What exactly do you want?" "A full emergency shutdown test." "With passengers?" "With weighted training dummies first." Grant frowned. "That isn't part of the certification protocol." "It should be." Before Grant could answer, one of the dispatch supervisors hurried into the garage. "They just confirmed Friday's event." He handed Grant another schedule. The mayor's office accepted the invitation. Grant looked at the page. So did the school board. "And Heartline's CEO is flying in." Darius's attention shifted immediately. "The CEO?" The supervisor nodded. "Evelyn Hart herself. She's giving the keynote before the student demonstration." The name lingered in the air. For 10 years, Darius had wondered whether she had ever remembered the rainy roadside outside Cleveland. Now she would be standing only a few feet away from the very buses carrying her company's name. Grant folded the schedule. All the more reason not to create unnecessary problems. Darius quietly closed his notebook. If there's a problem, he looked toward bus 1. It's already there. Late that afternoon, after everyone else had gone home, Darius requested access to Heartline's engineering database through the service portal. Access denied. He tried again using his supervisor credentials. Again. Access restricted. He wasn't surprised. Only Heartline engineers could view internal design histories. He shut down the computer and slipped the notebook back into his work bag. There would be another way. There always was. At that same moment, inside a glass-walled conference room overlooking downtown Chicago, Evelyn Hart stood before a projection screen filled with engineering drawings. An archivist placed a weathered prototype file on the table. We found the original development records you requested. Evelyn carefully opened the faded folder. A single photograph slid onto the table. It showed a rain-soaked prototype parked beside a highway. Next to the open rear door stood a young mechanic with grease on his sleeves. The image had no name written on the back, only 2 handwritten letters, followed by a number, EH7. Evelyn stared at the faded photograph for several long seconds. The edges had yellowed with age, and rain had blurred part of the image, but the young mechanic's posture was unmistakable. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows. One hand rested inside the open emergency door, while the other held a flashlight between his teeth. She remembered that night far more clearly than she had ever admitted. "Is this the only copy?" she asked quietly. The archivist nodded. "As far as we know. Most of the prototype records were digitized years ago, but this file stayed in storage because the project code changed before production." Evelyn gently turned another page. There were handwritten engineering notes, several calculations, a rough sketch of the emergency latch. Then, near the bottom margin, she found something that made her stop breathing for a moment. Mechanical override suggested by roadside mechanic. Test immediately. She slowly sat down. She remembered writing those words herself. Back then, Heartline Mobility wasn't a global manufacturer. It was a struggling startup, trying to convince investors that electric school transportation could be both practical and safer for children with disabilities. That rainy night had nearly ended everything. Instead, a stranger had pulled over. He had missed somewhere important. He had never once asked who she was. He had simply asked, "Where do you need this bus to go?" The archivist looked across the conference table. "Miss Hart?" Evelyn carefully closed the folder. "Who authorized the current EH7 revisions?" The archivist typed quickly. "The original platform evolved through several redesigns." "I know that. I'm asking who signed the latest revision." A few seconds passed. "The safety architecture was transferred to the commercial division 3 years ago." "Names." The archivist hesitated. "I'll need approval from legal." "You have it." Another search, another pause. Finally, a list appeared on the screen. Evelyn read each name without speaking. Vice President of Manufacturing, Supply Chain Director, Compliance Review Committee. She recognized every one of them. One signature in particular made her expression harden. Richard Lawson. He had personally led the company's cost reduction initiative 18 months earlier. "Pull every engineering change request connected to EH7, she said. "Every version." "Tonight?" "Tonight." Across the room, members of Heartline's executive team were already gathering for the afternoon strategy meeting. One of the attorneys stepped inside. "The Lakebriar hearing is attracting more media attention than expected." Evelyn looked up. "I saw. We recommend minimizing executive involvement." She remained silent. "The local maintenance contractor can handle the technical questions." "No." The attorney blinked. "You'll attend?" "I'll attend." There are liability concerns. I understand. If the mechanic's allegations are inaccurate, appearing in person gives them credibility. And if they're accurate. The room became very quiet. No one answered. Evelyn gathered the weathered folder into her briefcase herself, instead of leaving it with the archivist. As she reached the door, she looked once more at the faded photograph. She still couldn't remember his name. Only his face. Only the way he had refused to leave until the emergency door opened smoothly. Only the quiet sentence he had spoken before driving away into the storm. Kids don't get a second chance if the first door won't open. For 10 years, she had searched company records, prototype logs, and old project notes for the mechanic whose name had never been recorded. Now, for the first time, she wondered if that same man was standing alone in a maintenance garage in Lake Briar, believing she had forgotten him. She picked up her phone. "Cancel my virtual appearance." The assistant on the other end hesitated. "You'll need to travel." "I know. I want the corporate jet ready before sunrise." "And the board meeting?" "It can wait." Evelyn looked through the conference room windows toward the Chicago skyline glowing beneath the setting sun. "If that mechanic is who I think he is..." She tightened her grip on the old prototype file. "I've already kept him waiting far too long." The next morning, long before sunrise reached Lake Briar, Darius was already back inside the maintenance garage. The building echoed with familiar sounds that usually brought him comfort. The slow hum of battery chargers, the clatter of metal tools settling on workbenches, and the distant whistle of a freight train passing behind the transit yard. Today, none of it eased the weight pressing on his shoulders. Bus 1 waited exactly where he had left it. His notebook lay open beside the diagnostic computer, every page filled with careful observations. There were no dramatic conclusions, no accusations, just measurements, temperatures, timestamps, and the same tiny metallic chirp appearing again and again. Grant arrived carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. Without saying a word, he placed one beside Darius. "You've been here since 5? 4:30. Grant looked at the notebook. "You planning to spend another day chasing this?" "I'm planning to finish." Grant took a slow sip before lowering his voice. "Corporate called again." Darius didn't look up. "They're sending representatives for Friday." "I heard. They're expecting every bus to be signed off before then." "I know." Grant rested both hands on the workbench. "Darius, listen to me." His tone was no longer irritated. It sounded almost concerned. "If you keep delaying this, they're going to stop seeing you as the best mechanic in this garage." Darius finally looked at him. "They already have. They'll see you as the problem." He smiled faintly. "If that's what happens." He gently rested his hand on the rear emergency door. "I'd rather be the problem than ignore one." Grant looked away. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Grant reached into his folder and slid a single document across the bench. "Official notice." Darius unfolded it. "Mandatory demonstration schedule." His eyes scanned the page until they stopped on one line. "Student participants: Maya Cole, Lucas Bennett, and 12 additional students." His heartbeat slowed. Seeing Maya's name typed in black ink made everything feel painfully real. Grant noticed the change in his expression. "You didn't know?" "I knew she'd volunteered. I didn't know she'd already been assigned." The garage suddenly felt much smaller. Darius imagined Maya laughing with her classmates, completely unaware that her father was standing beside the very bus she would soon board. He folded the schedule carefully instead of crumpling it. "I need permission for 1 full emergency simulation." Grant shook his head. "I can't authorize that." "Why not?" "Because headquarters specifically instructed us not to perform any non-standard testing." "Why?" Grant hesitated. I wasn't given a reason. That answer troubled Darius more than a refusal. Every manufacturer welcomed additional proof that its product was safe. Avoiding another test made no sense. Unless... Grant's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen before answering. Grant Hollis. His expression slowly changed. Yes, he's right here. Grant covered the microphone. They want to speak with you. Darius accepted the phone. This is Darius Cole. A calm corporate voice introduced itself. Mr. Cole, this is Richard Lawson from Heartline Mobility. The name meant nothing to Darius. We understand you've requested additional inspections. That's correct. We appreciate your dedication. The words sounded polite, almost rehearsed. But our engineering department has already confirmed these vehicles exceed every required safety standard. I'm asking for one more live simulation. I'm afraid that won't be necessary. Darius looked through the bus windows toward the empty passenger seats. It will be for me. A short silence followed. Then Lawson replied, You've built an excellent reputation over the years, Mr. Cole. I've read your employment record. It would be unfortunate if a misunderstanding overshadowed that. The sentence wasn't a threat, not directly, but Darius understood exactly what it meant. He handed the phone back to Grant. The conversation was over. Grant rubbed his forehead. They're putting a lot of pressure on everybody. I can see that. You still going to keep pushing? Darius looked once more at Maya's name on the demonstration schedule. Then he quietly picked up his inspection notebook. I'm not pushing. He slipped the notebook into his work bag. I'm standing still. Outside the garage doors, a yellow school bus rolled past carrying children home from summer activities. Darius watched it disappear around the corner. Every child inside trusted that when an adult said a vehicle was safe, it truly was. He intended to make sure those words still meant something. That evening, Darius parked his aging pickup beneath the flickering light outside his apartment building. The engine clicked softly as it cooled. For a long moment, he remained behind the wheel, staring through the windshield without reaching for the door handle. The folded demonstration schedule rested on the passenger seat. Maya's name seemed to grow heavier every time he looked at it. Inside, the apartment smelled of tomato soup and toasted bread. Maya stood on a chair, stirring a small pot while humming to herself. You were late, she said with a smile. I didn't burn dinner. You've gotten better. I know. She grinned proudly before climbing down. They ate at the little kitchen table that had seen birthdays, homework, overdue bills, and more quiet conversations than either of them could count. Maya noticed he wasn't talking much. Long day? The usual. She tilted her head. That's your answer when it's definitely not the usual. Darius smiled despite himself. She had inherited that ability from her mother. Nothing escaped her for long. You remember the transportation demonstration next Friday? She nodded enthusiastically. Our class gets to test the new buses. I'm one of the first groups. I know. They're supposed to be the safest buses ever built. The words lingered between them. Darius lowered his spoon. What if? He searched for the right words. What if someone found something that needed to be checked first? Maya thought for a moment. Then they should check it. Even if it disappointed a lot of people? She shrugged. I'd rather be disappointed than hurt. Her answer came so quickly, it almost made him laugh. Children often found the simplest path through problems adults complicated. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a permission form. I need you to sign this. He read it carefully. Emergency evacuation demonstration, parent consent, medical information, asthma inhaler required. His eyes paused there. You'll carry your inhaler? She patted the front pocket of her backpack. Already packed. He signed the form, not because he had accepted the demonstration, but because he hadn't yet found a reason to stop it. After dinner, Maya disappeared into her room to finish a science project. Darius quietly opened the kitchen drawer beneath the coffee maker. Hidden beneath a stack of utility bills lay a worn envelope. Inside rested the cracked red reflector. The faded blue shoelace Maya had tied around it years earlier still held the broken pieces together. He turned it over in his hand. There were no names, no dates, no explanation anyone else would understand. Just a reminder that one decision could echo much longer than the moment it was made. His phone buzzed across the table. The caller ID showed his mother-in-law, Helen Brooks. He answered. "Hi, Helen. I heard about this hearing." News traveled quickly in Lake Briar. "It isn't until Friday." "I know." She hesitated. "Maya doesn't. I haven't told her everything." "You should." "I will." Helen sighed gently. "I'm not calling to argue." That surprised him. "I just wanted to ask." She paused. "Are you certain?" Darius looked toward Maya's bedroom door. He could hear her laughing softly at something on her laptop. "No," he answered honestly. "I'm certain something isn't right. And if you're wrong, I'll apologize to everyone. And if you're right?" He looked again at the permission slip lying beside the empty soup bowls. "Then I'll never forgive myself if I stay quiet." Helen didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice had softened. Her mother would have said the same thing. After the call ended, Darius carefully placed the cracked reflector back inside its envelope. Outside the apartment window, rain began tapping softly against the glass. Not a storm. Just enough to make the streetlights shimmer across the pavement. The sound carried him back to another rainy night, another roadside, another promise that still refused to let go. Across the country, a Heartline corporate jet lifted into the dark Chicago sky, its destination already programmed. Lake Briar. Neither Darius nor Evelyn knew it yet. By the time that airplane landed, the past they had carried separately for 10 years would finally begin catching up with them. Rain washed over the runway at Chicago Executive Airport as the Heartline jet climbed through low clouds. Evelyn sat alone near the window. The cabin lights were dim, but the old prototype folder remained open across her lap. She had read the same 3 pages so many times that night she no longer needed the words. Instead, she studied the faded photograph. The young mechanic had never smiled for the camera. His attention had been fixed entirely on the disabled shuttle behind him. One sleeve was soaked from the rain. The flashlight between his teeth cast a narrow beam across the open emergency latch. She remembered asking him whether he was a mechanic. He had answered with a tired grin. "Mostly I'm just somebody trying to get home." She closed her eyes. Back then she had been terrified. Her investors were waiting. The presentation could determine whether Heartline survived another month. The prototype had failed less than 20 miles from the convention center. Every roadside assistance company had quoted a wait of more than 2 hours. Then an old pickup had stopped. A stranger had stepped into the rain without asking for payment. Without asking who owned the vehicle. Without asking whether helping her would cost him something. Only later had she learned he had missed an interview because of that decision. And by then, he had disappeared. Across the aisle, Heartline's chief legal counsel approached quietly. "Miss Hart?" She looked up. "I've reviewed the media coverage." He handed her a tablet. Local news stations replayed footage of the maintenance garage. Darius appeared only briefly, walking past reporters with a lunchbox in one hand and a grease-stained notebook in the other. No dramatic speech, no interviews, no attempt to become the story. The attorney folded his hands. "Our recommendation hasn't changed." "I know." Allow local management to resolve this. Evelyn watched Darius disappear into the transit garage on the screen. Have you watched the complete rescue footage? We've reviewed the relevant sections. No. She looked directly at him. I asked whether you watched all of it. He hesitated. Only the portions attached to the incident report. You should watch the rest. There isn't enough time. There has to be. The attorney sighed. Our investors are expecting stability. Our customers expect safety. They're connected. They're not the same. The conversation ended there. The attorney quietly returned to his seat. Evelyn looked back out the window. Far below, city lights faded into darkness. She reached into the folder one last time. Tucked between two engineering drawings rested a small yellow sticky note she had written years earlier. Find the mechanic. The ink had faded. The promise had not. Meanwhile, 2 states away, Darius stood alone inside the maintenance garage. The building was nearly silent. Only one overhead light remained on above Bus 1. He had stayed long after his shift ended. Not because anyone asked him to, because every test raised another question. He connected the portable power simulator once again. Voltage dropped, backup systems engaged, interior lighting flickered. The familiar metallic chirp echoed through the rear latch. He watched the locking pin through the inspection mirror. It hesitated. Barely. Then settled into place. Again. Exactly the same. Consistent failures were easier to understand than random ones. Consistent failures meant there was a cause. He carefully packed away the testing equipment before locking his notebook inside his work bag. As he switched off the final light, his phone buzzed. A text message from Grant appeared. Corporate inspection team arrives tomorrow morning. Be here early. Darius slipped the phone back into his pocket. Tomorrow, the questions would no longer stay inside the garage. Tomorrow, people with titles, lawyers, and executives would begin looking at the same buses. He only hoped they were willing to see what the machines had been trying to say all along. The next morning arrived wrapped in gray skies and a steady drizzle that turned the transit yard into a mirror of wet concrete and flashing amber lights. Darius was already unlocking Bay 3 when the first black SUV rolled through the security gate. Hartline's inspection team had arrived. 4 people stepped out wearing crisp jackets embroidered with the company logo. 2 carried laptops. 1 held a hard-shell equipment case. The last introduced himself before anyone else. Neil Patterson, Corporate Field Engineering. Darius shook his hand. Darius Cole. Neil offered a polite smile that never quite reached his eyes. We're here to verify your concerns. I appreciate that. Grant appeared from the office carrying a visitor packet. Let's keep everything efficient, he said. We've got a full schedule. The corporate team walked slowly around Bus 1, photographing identification plates, checking software versions, and connecting diagnostic tablets to the vehicle. Colored graphs quickly filled their screens. Neil nodded with quiet confidence. All electronic systems are reporting within specification. Darius wasn't surprised. I didn't expect the software to find it. Neil glanced up. Why not? Because software only checks what it's told to measure. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Darius picked up his flashlight and knelt beside the rear emergency exit. Would you mind running 1 battery transfer cycle? A younger engineer pressed a button from inside the driver's seat. The cabin lights dimmed for a fraction of a second. Chirp. The tiny metallic sound disappeared beneath the hum of cooling fans. Neil frowned. I barely heard that. You heard it. I did. It's coming from inside the latch assembly. Neil crouched beside Darius. It could be normal movement. It could. Darius handed him the inspection mirror. Watch the locking pin. Another transfer. Chirp. Neil leaned closer. The pin hesitated, less than a heartbeat, almost impossible to notice. He straightened slowly. I saw something. Grant immediately stepped forward. What? Neil didn't answer right away. I'm not sure. Darius remained calm. I'm not asking anyone to trust my opinion. He opened his notebook to a page filled with neatly written observations. I'm asking you to repeat the test until you can explain what we're both seeing. Neil accepted the notebook. His expression changed as he flipped through page after page. Every test had been documented. Ambient temperature, battery voltage, time intervals, repeated results. No exaggeration, no emotional language, only evidence. You've been tracking this for days, Neil said quietly. Darius nodded. I wanted facts before I spoke. Grant folded his arms. So what's the verdict? Neil looked back at the bus. I can't give one yet. Grant's shoulders tightened. What do you mean? I mean, this deserves a closer inspection. One of the executives immediately objected. Neil, we have certified documentation from the factory. I've read it. Then why delay delivery? Neil looked at the tiny latch one more time. Because certification and investigation aren't the same thing. The words hung in the garage. For the first time since this began, Darius realized someone besides him had heard what the bus was trying to say. Before anyone could continue, another black SUV rolled into the yard. It wasn't marked with engineering decals. It carried executive plates. Grant looked toward the windshield and quietly muttered, almost to himself, she wasn't supposed to arrive until tomorrow. Darius followed his gaze. The rear passenger door slowly opened. A woman stepped onto the rain-soaked pavement, carrying nothing except a weathered leather folder that looked decades older than the luxury vehicle behind her. Even from across the yard, Darius recognized her. Evelyn Hart had come to the garage herself, and in that quiet moment, before a single word was spoken, the 10 years between them suddenly felt shorter than the few steps that still separated them. Sometimes the longest journeys don't end with applause. They end when someone finally remembers the person who changed everything. One quiet act of courage can reshape lives far beyond the moment it happens. Darius never stopped to ask what he would gain that rainy night. Yet a single decision became the foundation of a promise that reached across an entire decade. Today, think about one small choice you've been putting off because it seems too inconvenient. Make that choice anyway. The next time you're tempted to walk away, remember what Darius did, because you never know how far one honest act might travel. Have you ever helped someone without ever finding out what happened to them afterward? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if this journey stayed with you until the end, stay close, because the next story begins with another ordinary moment that changes someone's life forever.